Asset Bubbles Explained. This is a video that I did with the Libertarian comedy YouTube channel, Hypocrite Twins. I discussed the anatomy of an asset bubble, the current stock market bubble, and how the repo market fits into that equation. And I also review my investment strategies. This is a pretty fun, lighthearted collaboration video. The Hypocrite Twins have quite a few characters. It's actually just one guy. But one of them is an alien. This alien just cannot figure out why on earth, no pun intended, anyone would invest in the current stock market. And I try to help him figure that out. Let's dive right in.
This video was made in collaboration with the Libertarian investment channel George Gammon. And by that I mean actual collaboration, not how I sometimes steal people's stuff and act like I'm helping them. I'm the IRS of YouTube. I've traveled to the planet Earth to understand a concept you refer to as a financial bubble. I recently learned what the word stock market means, but someone told me it's a bad time to buy. Earth's banks are in emergency critical condition, but yet the stock market rips to all-time highs. To help explain this conundrum to me, please welcome our special guest, George Gammon. What is a bubble?
Thank you, Mr. Alien. I appreciate you having me on your channel, and I would be more than happy to explain what a bubble is. Let's start by looking at the actual definition. According to Investopedia, a bubble is an economic cycle characterized by the rapid escalation of asset prices followed by a contraction. It is created by a surge in asset prices unwarranted by the fundamentals of the asset and driven by exuberant market behavior. When no more investors are willing to buy at the elevated price, a massive sell-off occurs, causing the bubble to deflate. Let's explore this further by looking at the anatomy of an asset bubble. The historic trend line of the price of the asset starts off flat because no one really knows about it, then the price gradually goes up, and it has its first little sell-off there, but people start to get even more interested, and pretty soon the media picks up on it. Well, once the media picks up on it, then everybody knows about it, and they start piling in. The enthusiasm grows, and it turns into greed, and then at the top of the bubble, it's outright delusion. People think that this is the next new thing. It sells off a bit because there are just no more buyers. And then we go into our denial phase, where all the people that bought in here don't want to admit that the prices aren't going to continue to rise. But that doesn't last very long. And then we go into the stage of complete fear because all these people that bought up here have now lost a lot of money. The price continues to plummet until we get to capitulation. What this means is everybody, even the people that were right around here that were so bullish on the asset, have just thrown in the towel and given up on it. The price further declines until we get into this stage, which is just complete despair. You can generally tell what stage of the cycle we're in by what the average investor is saying compared to the smart investor. The average investor has FOMO, fear of missing out. They're telling the smart guy, boy, you are crazy. If I would have stayed out of the market these last few years, I would have missed out on all these gains. But the smart investor says, I don't worry about the past. I only buy assets when they're cheap. The average guy says, oh, that's crazy. This is a new paradigm shift. You just can't tell because you're too old-fashioned. The smart investor says, yep. That's what they always say. This time, it's different. And he goes back and says, no, I'm so smart. Look at all this money I've made. And the smart investor says, don't confuse brains with a bubble. Then the fear kicks in, the capitulation kicks in, and this same average investor, now he's lost all of his money. And what does he say now? Sell, sell, sell. You've got to sell at any price. Prices will never go up again. And if you buy now, you've got to be crazy. And of course, the smart investor looks at that asset and now it's cheap. He comes in and he buys it and he rides it right back up. And who does he sell to? when that asset is in a bubble again, but the same average investor.
Man, he makes it sound so easy. What do you mean you didn't sit on the sidelines for 5 or more years while all your friends and family made money? Don't you read Investopedia? Baby, we don't need to use a condom. I can pull out before it busts. That's what you said about the NASDAQ. Now we're gonna have 2 reasons we'll be bankrupt.
Mr. Alien, you may be asking yourself, that is weird. That sounds extremely illogical. And you would be right. But let's go over why the last couple bubbles have happened, and I think it'll be far more clear. Specifically, let's look at the housing bubble. The Federal Reserve drops rates low, artificially low, below where the market would have them. This creates more money in the system. It also forces investors to take more risk. Because those interest rates go down on a safe asset, quote unquote safe asset, like a treasury, in order for the investors to get an adequate return, they have to take on more and more and more risk. So back in 2002, 2003, when Alan Greenspan dropped those interest rates artificially low, the investors looked for an asset class that was more risky but would give them a higher return. They focused on housing. Before the Federal Reserve dropped those interest rates, let's pretend there was this much money chasing the housing market. Well, it's just like inflation, when a lot of the price has to do with how much money is actually chasing those goods or services. Since there was a normal amount of money chasing housing before the Fed dropped interest rates, housing prices, they're pretty reasonable. But when the Fed came in and pumped all this money into the system through these artificially low interest rates, housing went to the moon because there was so much more money and so much more appetite for risk chasing the same amount of goods and services. And we can throw up one of my favorite charts of the housing market, adjusted for inflation, going back to 1890, and you'll see that it fits the anatomy of a bubble almost perfectly.
You know who didn't know this? Ben Bernanke. Right before the housing market collapsed, he said that housing prices were supported by strong fundamentals. Come on, don't you read Investopedia? Do the Federal Reserve repo injections help to alleviate this bubble?
That is a great question. To your earlier point, the stock market is now at all-time highs. What happened when the housing bubble deflated, the Fed had to quickly go in there and inflate another bubble because the US economy now is built on asset prices, debt, and confidence. It's a house of cards, and the Fed knows this. So since they couldn't inflate another housing bubble, they moved on to stocks. So they printed even more money and they lowered interest rates even further. They went to a ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. That created the same type of situation that we had in the housing bubble, where you had a lot more money chasing the same amount of stocks. So initially there was this much money in the stock market, and just like housing, prices were around this point. They pumped all this excess liquidity into the market, and that drove prices all the way up here to where now, to your point, stocks are at an all-time high, just like housing was. So to answer your question specifically about the repo market, they've taken more liquidity and pumped it into the repo market to save the repo market. What are those financial institutions going to do with that money who are borrowing it in the repo market? They're going to inject it into the stock market, which is going to drive prices even further and make that bubble even bigger. So does it alleviate the problem? Absolutely not. It exacerbates the problem.
So then what should I do to invest?
The first investment tip I can give you, Mr. Alien, is get on your spaceship and go right back to your own planet. Because here on Earth, we are in the everything bubble, and you don't want anything to do with these markets. But if you are an earthling and you're restricted to investing on the planet Earth, here's what I would suggest. First and foremost, you want to try to buy things that are cheap and sell them when they're expensive. The only thing that's cheap right now in the United States is 30-year fixed rate mortgages. So how do you express that bet? You buy a nice, modest rental property in a good area like Kansas City or Little Rock, Arkansas, where the price to income ratios are relatively modest and they're not in a big bubble. You hopefully buy it for under the cost of construction. You get a good income stream with an RV ratio that's over 1%. And you've got to diversify. So you not just have a rental portfolio, but you got to diversify with some insurance, which is precious metals. And you've got to diversify your political risk and your currency risk. So even if you're an American, it's a good idea to just set up a bank account in another country. It can never hurt. And put a couple bucks in that bank account that might be denominated in a different currency. There's no downside to doing that. And just for your viewers today, as a special bonus tip, I'm going to give you some advice that I promise your viewers they have never, ever heard before. An additional store of value that I think you may find interesting outside of precious metals is, editor, give me a drum roll please, old school pickup trucks. And I'll bet you that was the last thing that you thought I would say, but it's very true. I actually own $100,000 or a little bit more of old school Fords, 1995s to 02s. They are collectible right now. Get them with low miles, off Craigslist, in a no-rust state. Park them in your garage, and when you need the liquidity, whether we go through deflation or inflation, you put that thing up on eBay, and I can almost guarantee you, you'll maintain your purchasing power. I'd like to thank Mr. Alien for having me today, and I look forward to seeing you and every one of your viewers hopefully on a different galaxy, one without any central banks. For more information like this, check out this content right here, and I will see you on the next video.